Picture this. It's 2020. Amid protests and urgent calls for justice against systemic brutality, a single social media post ignites a firestorm of activism. The hashtag Black Lives Matter. As this rallying cry moved from the tweets to the streets, Black Twitter solidified itself as a beacon, a digital sanctuary where activism, joy, and solidarity could thrive. Over the years, some folks organized while others shared hilarious memes and clever hashtags like Growing Up Black, bringing much needed levity to our timelines. And it really created space for us to celebrate the beauty of Black life with our whole chest, y'all. Long before the internet was a thing, though, our communicative practices actually had similar reach, impact, and power. But back then, we couldn't always say it with our whole chest. Back then, we had to speak in codes. I'm Darren from PushBlack, and you're listening to Black History Year. Now, Black communities have long leveraged language as a tool of resistance and connection. Often, our survival even hinged on the mastery of a secret language, a coded communication hidden in plain sight. But today, in a time where digital platforms have emerged as vital arenas for Black expression, understanding the legacy and possibilities within Black communication is more crucial than ever. Joining us to shed light on this and much, much more is Dr. Andre Brock, a leading scholar and author of Distributed Blackness, African American Cybercultures. In his work, Andre explores the evolution of digital vernacular expression and how Black users navigate and subvert digital spaces. So get ready, folks. Andre is offering us a roadmap to understand the transformative power of Black language. What's up, fam? Before we dive into the episode, I have one small favor to ask. Please spread the word about Black History Year on social media. Podcasting is competitive, y'all, and the best way to grow is through your promotion. You can shout out this episode or share one lesson from it you found super interesting. Just tag us at We Are PushBlack on Instagram and TikTok so more folks can access the Black history they didn't teach us in school. Your support means the world to us, and your minute of effort makes our hours of work worth it. So thank you, fam. Now, let's get back to the show. We want to jump right into it. The way we like to open up our conversations here at Black History Year, we like to ask our guests, what does Black liberation look like to them? But more specific for our conversation today, I want to know, Andre, from your perspective, what does Black liberation sound like to you?
Talking about Black liberation is always tricky for me because I like to ask the audiences when I give talks, what type of people will we be when liberation comes, right? And so liberation seems to often ask us to prepare to be soldiers in a struggle, or at least support troops for the soldiers. And when you're always in a mood of fighting, there's an adrenaline rush, there's cortisol, there are other chemicals that release that make you react to the world in a certain way. And so that's why for the last few years, I've been focusing instead on Black joy and Black optimism, right? And so I think liberation is necessary. I'm very much an adherent of Derek Bell's racial realism, where I know I have to fight to get out of these structures, but I also will try to lead the best life I can for myself and my children, right? And so I would argue instead of Black liberation, I argue that we should continue to work towards freedom, but we should also try to build a convivial society, something where the things that we build, the institutions that we inhabit, the spaces that we occupy are geared toward a quality of life that is not extractive or exploitive. So in many ways, it's more of an abolition mindset. It's not quite decoloniality, but it's liberating in the sense that it suggests that aesthetically, intellectually, and spiritually, there's more to life than simply a political struggle for freedom and agency.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much for that rich answer. And that's one reason why we really appreciate your work, Andre, because you center the juicence of Black expression, Black life, the joy, Afro optimism. So thank you for bringing that in and just setting the convo for us. From hiding maps in cornrows, thinking of enslaved Black folks hiding escape routes in their cornrows, to the Green Book, which you write about yourself. I'm curious, Andre, how do you see Black expression, even beyond like the written and spoken language, right? How do you see that being essential to our survival?
So I try to be careful, right? Because there have been populations that have been minoritized across human history. In many ways, before this most recent last 6 months, the Jewish people were people that the Black folk could understand in terms of their biblical journeys for freedom and liberation and the oppression they lived in other places. But Blackness is different for me because I believe that for Blackness, there's a particular aesthetics of invention and style and wit, right? That's really essential to Blackness. It doesn't always necessarily translate, like the Jewish Society is very much famous for their capacity for the written word, right? And many of one of my favorite quotes from W.E. Du Bois, lions don't have historians. A lot of Black history has never been recorded, right?
Mm,
But you can see legacies of Black life and Black joy when you see videos side by side of Black people in the US doing one thing and Black people on the continent doing another, right? Or Black people in the continent doing one thing and Black people in the Caribbean doing another. And they have these commonalities. And so I would argue that Black is an excess of life. Above and beyond what modernity demands and requires of us, above and beyond the labor capacity that capitalism wants to stick us into, we live life freely and fully. And that's another reason why Du Bois has been so important to me, because he talks about that excess of life in ways that really pay homage to everyday Blackness, which is my thing.
absolutely, absolutely. That excess of life, and you see that operating in the way that we communicate as well. You mentioned that wit, um, that process, that the aesthetic of invention, as you mentioned. You
Mhm.
see that operating just in everyday vernacular communication. Would you say?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. There a meme just happened the other day. Uh, so the WNBA had their draft, and
Yes.
we found out that those ladies were getting underpaid, right? But all of a sudden, brothers decided how they would act if WNBA players started flying them out like NBA players fly out the young women. And so all these pictures of guys like in the kitchen with an apron on, the famous scene from Baby Boys where Ving Rhames is cooking bacon in the kitchen butt naked, right? And so that invention that you right there, like, and that's something, and I write about this in the book too. I talk about this phenomenon called the N-word Navy. I don't know if I can I say the actual N-word on here? So the nigger Navy, right? And we can take things that are mundane, ordinary, not worthy of comment, and make them into something that is entertaining and insightful and can also be critical, right? But it always again comes back to this excess of life. We never just take the basic, the bare minimum. We always add the extra to it.
Just thinking about this particular moment that you call out with regards to the WNBA, just the performances of gender online and offline, I personally feel has been shaped by that medium, whether it's Black Twitter or TikTok.
Mhm.
Just in the different articulations of what it means to be man or woman, non-binary, gender roles within a relationship. There's ways that we've kind of shifted and shaped how we think and approach these things. Does that land with you? Does that track at all?
It does. And I have something that's kind of like off the beaten path in terms of theorizing it. But one of the things I talk about in my own work is how the digital allows me to be Black without my body. Not that my body ever limited me to being Black, but the capacity to express myself in a medium that didn't necessarily require my body to participate, I think has similarly been liberating for trans movements, for feminist movements, for queer movements, for non-binary movements, right? Even though they find media that can express them, they'll upload ballroom videos, they'll upload all kinds of other things that express the ways they are, but there's something freeing, right? And being able to express that and have other people meet you where you're no longer that one person in the community or that one person in the household that feels that way. You now have a community that basically is interested in the same things you are. Might not all agree on the same things, right? But there's a community of non-binary folk. There's a community of bears, right? there's all these other communities that you may not have been able to access in your physical without danger or violence, and the internet has become that space. And so yes, it's absolutely been freeing for many minoritized communities.
This is perfect because this brings me right to the next question I want to raise to you, specifically around this notion of informational blackness. And how does that tie into this expression through technology, but moving beyond just the borders of the flesh, beyond the body? What is informational blackness? And what does that have to say about Black communication?
I actually love this concept of informational Blackness. Just going back to what I just said, right? That you can ascertain my Blackness without ever encountering my body. And some of this came across because there are studies that show that if a Black person calls you on the phone, you can immediately identify their Blackness. And if their accent sounds familiar, you might start saying, well, who your family is, who you related to, where you do we kinfolk, right? And there's something very recognizable about the sonics of Blackness, right? The ways we sing, the way we talk, the way we express, even the way we pause, right? I think I've said the word listen in all caps 17 times today, right? Or my favorite, because it's just egregious, the phrase WHEWCHILE, or child, right? And when I say it to you, you know it's an expression of exasperation or tiredness or just like I'm done with it, but just like, can you believe this? And white folk found that and they looked at the spelling and they're like, well, what does Wu Chile mean? Right. And so right. So we bring an intonation, we bring an aesthetic, we bring a philosophy of experience in the world where the collective is important and the health of the collective is important, but also that wit, wisdom, and invention, and that all comes through in our expressions of self. Right. I was reading a really good book, Time by Dan Charnas, and it's a biography of sorts of Jay Dilla, right, the famous hip hop producer. And he said something really interesting that Black folk changed European music because European music has a rhythm, right? They did balls and waltzes and everything else. Black folk brought polyrhythm to European music. So from polyrhythm, you get rock, you get soul, you get funk, you get jazz, you get hip hop, you get dancehall, and so many other things that stem from the polyrhythmic ways that we interpret, that we work through music. We don't just focus on harmony and melody, but there's also complex drum patterns going through in there. And the thing that's significant about Dilla, and the thing that's making its way into my next book, is that not only do we a complex understanding of rhythm and time, but Dilla's transformative contribution to hip hop music is that he did a slight time slide, so things would be subtly offbeat, but on
like note.
One of the ways I try to explain it is I talk about the concept of color people time.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And
Yes.
I call color people time a complex disregard, an aesthetic disregard for labor capitalism and modernity. Because I might be late, but I'm always on time. Right. Right. So it's not necessarily conforming to a strict, rigid structure of time and modernity and space, but being inventive and working around the beat and under the beat and through the beat. Right. And so that is something that is specific to Black cultures. There are other cultures that do polyrhythms, right, but not in the same ways that Black folk do it.
I want to ask a question about the talking drums, and how does that fit
Go for it.
legacy? Because I think
Yes.
about the sonic logics that we bring to language just throughout, as you mentioned, the ways in which we approach rhythm and time in general. I'm curious, what do you think about just the sonic thinking that happens in the diaspora as it relates to our communication? I think often about how on Black Twitter specifically, Black folks will just tweet out an acronym and we will automatically know, right?
We'll automatically pick up on it.
Yes, that internal
Right.
sound that we're able to.
IYK.
Yes, yes, indeed. Oh my God. It's a terrible thing to joke about, but again, our excess of life and how we deal with tragedy makes me think about this. But whenever there's an active shooter situation, and Black folks will tweet a picture of Betty White, and the ways in which we engage with that, right? It's not a visual thing in and of itself. It's the sonic, right? I'm curious if you have any thoughts just on that, just on our sonic logics and how we deal with that.
So the Jay Dilla stuff was my entry into starting to think about social media as an orality space. And I'm not the first person to talk about communication as an oral thing. There's a famous Jesuit priest, Walter Ong, who talks about the difference between oral cultures and written cultures. My colleague, Catherine Knight Steele, has written about social media as a secondary orality. And the thing that's interesting about orality is that it's an aggregative media, right? It requires that you pay attention because sound is ephemeral. Right? If once it's heard, it's no longer exists. So when you see Black people doing call and response, they are speaking, listening, and responding in a way that brings a congregation together, that brings a group together. That's a sonic way of thinking, right? An oral listening way of thinking. And some social media, and I focus on Twitter, so I'm kind of a fanboy, right? But I think Twitter is one of the best examples of where the call and response happens, right? Where you can see the rhythms of the conversations grow, swell, then fall down and die, right? in ways that kind of replicate how conversations go in physical spaces. And if you think about it too, one of my favorite things to talk about for Black physicality and embodiment and sound is when Black people laugh. Because a laugh is simply an utterance from your mouth. Have you ever seen a Black person laugh and sit still?
Never.
You would think that person was a psychopath. When we laugh, we are all over the place, right? So we continually, and I call it in the book an embodied cognition, right? Where our thinking is also expressed not just through the capacity of our mind, but the ways in which our bodies move through space and time. So this comes back to informational blackness, right? And so again, going from the being able to recognize a voice on the phone and knowing that it's a Black person and immediately cluing in, but also again, that not necessarily needing the physical body to understand that Blackness is happening in this particular space. It's a transfer of information between you and a listener. And it doesn't always, one of the things I tried to do in the book is make it clear that culture doesn't happen in a vacuum. So there's a conversation going on online right now about how certain people aren't Black enough. If you don't have 4 Black parents, you're not Black enough. 4 Black grandparents, sorry. Or looking at Creole folk in Louisiana who are pale as pale can be and saying they're not Black. And my thing is, Blackness does not exist in isolation. Blackness has been defined in the U.S. If a white person can look at you and say you're not white, you're not white. You are often going to be Black. They might say you spicy white, but that's a new thing.
Yes.
Right. In the famous novel Passing, the main character was often assumed to be Mexican, right? Because she had fair features and curly hair, but she was Black, right? And so the idea that information about our world, the social structures we move in, the power structures that we move in, but also our sense of self is, again, it's an oral thing. For me, it's discourse. I would add though, because in many cases, white Southerners sound Black. There's another piece of that for that information, and that piece is intentionality. Paul Mooney said it best.
Everybody want to be a nigga, but nobody want to be a nigga.
Right. So if somebody is willing to say, I'm taking on this burden, not because I feel it's a burden, but because it's my life and my joy, that's very different from somebody who says, I want to be invited to the cookout or I want to be an ally, right? That's somebody who literally, hip hop has said it best, down for the cause. The way I try to define Blackness is not the traits you have. It's not your nose. It's not your hair texture. It's not your skin color, but it's how we understand the ways in which you employ the commonplaces necessary for us to understand you as being part of a Black tradition and in love with the Black tradition.
Absolutely. It's a relational thing, right?
That's the best word ever. That's the word I should have used.
Yeah, absolutely. It has to do with relationality and positionality. Okay. This was so rich. I want to make sure that we get to the portion where we talk about reclaiming these traditions, which you've already spoken to in the digital space, but I want to give a little bit of a history to this. So I want to talk specifically about the social, cultural, and political power of Black communication. I want to know, Andre, what makes us more prone, or I don't even know if you would say we're more prone, but what makes us more prone to using digital communication platforms, and how have we used them for our own interest?
I don't know if we're more prone. I mean, as much as people talk about Black Twitter, Black folk are only 23% of Twitter users. That's more than the 13% of Black population in the U.S., but 23%. There are more Latinos on Twitter than there are Black people, but you would never know, right? There's some really interesting history when Black folk first took to radio. And I definitely think there's a linkage going back to Sonics, right? Between radio and internet, right? And so Black folk in the 20s and 30s saw radio as a way to broadcast things that Black people needed to know across the air to give them better lives, right? So if you think about the Fisk Jubilee Singers, right? If you think about HBCUs giving home ec classes to train women who had a radio because TV wasn't a thing, right? So they could listen to it while they did their domestic chores or raise their kids or whatever, right? And they saw it as an educational medium, right? And as a medium that would make us more modern. But at the same time that these folk were trying to use, the churches and educational institutions were trying to use this new technology to uplift and educate Black people, there were people on the radio playing jazz music and blues music and doing the fast talking, slick talking stuff, the DJs that before we even had DJs, right? They weren't cutting records. They were literally just spinning records and playing them over the air for audiences, right? And the Black professional folk would get upset because those programs would be much more popular than the ones where you were trying to tell people to be more modern and respectable. And in part, I argue that's because Black people understand the game to a certain extent. even from our own people. Respectability can be carceral.
Mm.
What reason do you need me to be more modern, more modest, right? Why do girls need to dress more appropriately so that boys won't molest them, but you won't teach boys not to rape girls,
Mm-hmm.
right? And
Mm-hmm.
so they understand that modernity is kind of a trick bag, right? But in the meantime, and going back to this excess of life, one thing we love to do is celebrate, right? We
Yes.
made it through another day. We made it to the end of the week, right? We made it through this planting season, right? We having a fish fry at the church, right? We're gonna feed your body and your soul, right? We celebrate, and so that mode of celebration, I think, is much more prevalent, but not as often talked about for Black communications because it doesn't advance a particular political cause,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So again, going back to liberation, I always ask people, what type of person will you be when the war is won? Will you know how to party? Will you know how to celebrate? Right.
Yeah.
And people are like, oh, yeah, we do that all the time. Well, let's theorize what it means to live a life where that could be the thing that we focus on, as opposed to the thing that we necessarily have to do in order to build resources to survive to the next day, to thrive to the next day. Right. And I'm kind of, I still think I'm kind of an outlier in this. And I say that because this concept of Black joy has become really popular over the last few years, but it's always reframed in the sense that we need to do it as resistance,
Yeah.
or we need to do it as resilience, right? And these are concepts that are deeply tied into modernity, nationality, right,
Mm-hmm.
and capitalism, right?
Yeah.
And I'm like, you don't have to turn your hobby into a hustle, right? Rest should be rest. It should not be rest simply so you can get up and go to work the next day, right?
Mm-hmm.
There are things in life that are going out and touching grass, basically, right? That are necessary to have a good life. And I think that's something we need to get back to, what it means to have a good life as opposed to being free or being rich, right?
Absolutely.
But again, that's Ruthless and Gilmore's definition of what abolition is.
One thing that I'm hearing, I don't want to go too much off on the tangent, but this reminds me so much of just the Black studies tradition, the ways in which you look to these Black vernacular practices, not as expressions of resistance, but as an excess of life, as you mentioned,
Mm-hmm.
and really treating that as a source for knowledge production, for a way of thinking about
Absolutely.
living more freely, more liberated now. So thank you so much for lifting that up. And just thinking about this
Thank
tip
you.
around celebration, there is a platform that's near and dear to my heart when I think about Black celebration. So I'm formally trained as a filmmaker, and when this
Mm-hmm.
platform appeared, I really feel like it was the birth of Lumiere brothers again, specifically because of what Black people did there. So
Mm-hmm.
Vine. I have to know how you feel about Vine because so many people have forgotten that.
Gone too soon. Gone too soon. There is no TikTok without Vine. None. Right. And Vine, like Twitter, encouraged this a really fantastic kind of creativity, because when you have less time to build nuance, you have to build into your communication ways to affect people. And so it's not simply the logical, the the objective, the rational arguments that you can make. You really need to hit people hard in their funny bone or in their sorrow bone, right? Catharsis, right? And Vine was so good at that. There are so many people, so many of our YouTube stars used to be Vine stars, right? TikTok stars, not so much because it's a different medium, but a lot of people who are famous from YouTube started out on Vine. The Paul brothers, right?
Ah,
In part because you have 6 seconds. You might take 3 hours to set up the shot and the action, or even try to tell the story. One of my favorite Vines was an entire relationship in the 6 seconds. The boy meets girl, boy messes up with girl, girl breaks up with boy cries. 6 seconds,
yeah.
right? So if you don't have time to do extensive layers of exposition or scene setting or anything else, or even cinematography, right?
Mm,
You have to focus on the human connection. You have to tap into human themes that get people to understand who they are and what they are. And it just so turns out that Blackness and its excess of life translated really well to Vine, because we live large, we
mhm.
connect large, right? One of the things that people have tried to train out of me is because Blackness is an expressive culture, and my friends make fun of me all the time. When I give talks, my hands are doing this. I'm done, right? Because it's, again, embodied cognition, right? And
Ah,
that sense of movement, that kinetic thinking, that kinetic connection translated really well to the short format of Vine and to TikTok. To be fair, even though TikTok is trying to become YouTube, where they want longer videos so they can monetize them, right?
mm,
But that short format of TikTok is the same thing. even when the other girl did 52 episodes of Why Did I Get Married, right? That's not what TikTok was originally built for, right? It was that quick 1 minute jump in, jump out, do a little dance or whatever, right? And so the shorter the format, the more you have to rely on connecting with people through their affect, through their feelings, than you can on longer logical arguments.
I love that word affect. I honestly believe the ways in which Black folks have engaged Vine, TikTok, and really just our history of orality and oral storytelling, I find it's much more of a rhythm of affect rather than placing exposition and plot points, right? One thing that comes up for me, though, just a little stickler question. When thinking about just the aesthetics of Blackness and folks who perform online wanting to be invited to the cookout, I'm curious, how do you navigate this concept of digital blackface? And
Mm,
along with that, do you ever feel like these digital black spaces where these intimate discourses in community debates are happening, do you feel like that may require gatekeeping on some level, or could it ever be gatekept?
listen, so appropriation is a thing. The only reason why European modernity even happened is because they appropriated us from the continent for our labor potential, right? And one of the things that white Americans in particular, the West too, but white Americans in particular don't realize is how Black they are, right? So
Mm,
they have been stealing. Toni Morrison wrote a fantastic book, 1997, Playing in the Dark, where she says American Letters is premised on white people's relationship with Blackness, not necessarily Black bodies, but Blackness as figure in a figuration of lust, of excess, of desire, of even deviance, right? If you think about the noir films of the 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s, right? It's about being deviant, right? In a way that is not upright and moral like whiteness likes to portray itself, right? And some of that is premised on relationships with Blackness, right? And so digital blackface is difficult for me, in part because as I've understood blackface itself, it's a white person's performance by doing something, say putting boot black on their face or
mm,
wearing particular clothing and costumes, right? And that makes them do a caricature of Blackness. But the digital blackface, in the way it's been talked about, is people using GIFs. And
mhm.
GIFs are a really interesting technology for me because in many cases, the GIFs are not created by the white people to express themselves. They're taking GIFs from a library where people over the years have separated out bits and pieces, clips of the media that they loved and turned it into something, a reaction GIF, right? Or Nene talking about, ooh, child, the ghetto, right? Or Nene's perfect. She's a GIF machine, right? And my argument is in those clips that are captured, the artist themselves is not doing blackface,
Mm,
right? And it's not that the white person is putting on a costume in order to do a Black thing. It's that the way they know how to express their selves, their feelings, their interior states, their emotion, their excess is by accessing the Black body. So it's still appropriation, but
mhm.
it ain't blackface, right? Because if you're saying it's blackface, then you're accusing those actors of being minstrels,
Yeah, yeah,
right?
absolutely.
Viola Davis taking her wig off in the mirror and crying. Those are not blackface moments. Those are moments in many cases of vulnerability or pride or heroism and the like. And so for a white person to use that doesn't make it a blackface moment. It
Mhm.
just doesn't. Right. It's like saying if we for all those years we had yellow emoji, we were all doing yellow face.
Yeah.
Nobody's saying that. It's the same concept.
Wait,
It's the
hold on,
same
hold on.
concept.
I got a quick rebuttal though. How do you feel when you texting your Black friends, Black homies, Black family, and they respond with white emojis?
I'd already blocked all them people. So either the white emoji or the American flag. Like, come on. But I like if you really want to talk about digital blackface, what color is your which on the spectrum is your color on the 6 colors you get to choose from when you get to colorize your emoji, right?
Yeah.
My friends will call me out on a regular basis because they're like, your emoji is darker than you are. Look, mind your business, right? Is that blackface, right? Am I trying to be blacker than I actually am on this camera? Like, no, but I see myself as a Black person. And that one, the one that's a little bit lighter than the one that I choose, looks more like APA, Polynesian people. It's not the Blackness that I'm familiar with. I'm down with I'm over here with the darker shades. I'm not the darkest one,
Yeah.
What the Wu-Tang Clan song, butter pecan, caramel, chocolate, whatever. Right? I'm
That's
one of them flavors. I ain't no vanilla though. And so informationally, if you're saying somebody who is doing an authentic performance for which they were paid, for which we celebrate them for because we connected from them, if you're saying they're now being used so white people can do blackface, that's a misunderstanding of both the technology and the history of appropriation in the United States.
And I love that reframing, just to bring back Sonic Logics in a little bit. It makes me think about sampling and
Hmm.
our history of sampling traditions, right? We're sampling the Black embodied expression and mobilizing that in
Right.
different contexts. Wow. One thing that I am still stuck on is just that gatekeeping question, specifically because there's a project released back in February. I believe it's titled Historically Black Phrases, the Book of Historically Black
I
Phrases.
got it. I haven't opened it, but I did buy it.
Yeah. I'm curious. How do you feel about that project and just the pushback from Black folks against that project, cataloging these historically Black phrases? Do you feel like that book is an attempt to reclaim Black communication, or how does that land with you?
I mean, Black people are right to be skeptical of academics and other folk who want to come in and make money off the things that we do on an everyday basis, and we don't get paid for them, but they do. So, like this young white woman who now has a contract with the NBA to cut up NBA uniforms into dresses and outfits, when Black teens were doing that a decade ago for prom, right? Or Kim Kardashian as an innovator of the cornrow. Come on, fam. Like, right. And so rightfully, we want to hold on to what's ours. In some cases, we want to try to profit off of it, but I think that's a dead end, because once you open it up to commodify it, you no longer have control of the process of commodification. Once you say it can be bought, anybody can buy it, right? So that measure of gatekeeping doesn't work for me. But gatekeeping does a valuable function. It lets you know who is able to access resources within the community and who does not deserve to access those resources, right? And in some ways, the traditions, like you mentioned, where we were putting maps in the cornrows so that people could navigate their way to freedom on their children's heads, right?
Mhm.
Some of that stuff is for us because it was necessary for our survival. That stuff should be gatekept, right? There are other things that they're too easily transferable. But a lot of the Black idioms, a lot of the Black traditions, a lot of our history, right, which they clearly don't want, right,
Mhm.
because it tells the truth about them. Those things should and could be gatekept, but they should also be preserved and written about. I ran an event last year at CUNY Journalism called the Black Twitter Summit. And for your listeners probably might know this already. So it was me and a bunch of academics who study Twitter, all of us Black.
Mhm.
But we also invited the people who invented the technologies that we use
Oh,
to do this Blackness. Ain't no Black people who did that. We invited the white people who invented Twitter. We invited the white guy who invented Mastodon. We had Craig Newmark who invented Craigslist.
oh, wow.
But when Black Twitter found out about it, they're like, well, why would you have white people in a Black Twitter summit? It's supposed to be for us, by us. They don't know nothing about it. I'm like, damn, they invented this shit. Nobody wanted to hear that. Right.
Mhm.
And so I was getting gatekept because they felt like I was not being faithful to the Black community by inviting people to talk about something that they deem is very important, that I deem is very important to us. But
Yeah.
I'm like, it's the same way I would talk to the inventor, the person who came up with Cadillacs, right? If I want to talk about Cadillac as a car culture for African Americans in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, right? And wasn't no Black person doing that. That was a white person, right? And so sometimes structurally, we get angry because we know the tendency of white people to want to take and exploit the things that we have, and
Mhm.
that's perfectly fine. But sometimes we get a little too carried away, and uh, you can cut this. Go ahead, mark this on your thing. We could talk about ADOS, American
Oh,
Descendants of Slavery, right?
yeah.
Because they're attempting to gatekeep, and I often wonder what their strategy, their long term strategy is. You're doing divisiveness in the Black community. You're saying that only people with 4 Black grandparents, or if you have a white mother, you can't be Black, right? And I'm like, but Black folk, 89% of Black folk in this country, and that includes the immigrant populations, has white ancestry. So
Mhm.
how are then you saying you can't be Black if there's a white person in your family when that's the condition for all of us here? That was how white people made money. They impregnated Black women and sold their kids, right? Or they just raped Black women for fun because there was no criminal charges associated with it, right? And so you're doing a disservice, one, to that history, but also to the fact that even with that violence enacted upon our women, right, we still have a culture, a discernible culture, a powerful culture. Like, we just come in shades. There is no, everybody in Africa is not deep dark chocolate. They have
Mm,
shades over there too. And so that type of gatekeeping frustrates me, right?
absolutely.
Because it's counterintuitive to the project of collectivity and ultimately liberation if you're already cutting out people who are in your hood with you, who have built with you, who have you have kids with, that you go to school with, but you're saying they can't belong because something they had no control over happened
Hmm.
that brought them into this world. And so that type of gatekeeping really frustrates me. And a lot of that is happening digitally. I don't see as much of it as offline, but I don't leave the house much.
Copy that. No, this is very interesting, very provocative as well, because I often think about just the legions of bot armies that are operating on these platforms today, and how to navigate that and how to make sense of like disarmingly sincere responses from folks who identify as ADOS, versus just this, I don't know, like this constant feed of just vitriol. It's
Yeah.
almost like rage farming, you know?
Yeah.
Um, and it is honestly hard to navigate. But there is one last, I don't know, cultural artifact related to gatekeeping. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention. I'm thinking about the CGI influencers,
Mm-hmm.
use the aesthetics of blackness, um,
Mm-hmm.
modification, or just to kind of build a platform or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Have you engaged this at all?
I mean, makeup is analog CGI, right? So you mentioned blackfishing earlier,
Hmm.
right? And they're Eastern European women. Hell, you have locks. There's a long tradition of Japanese women getting tans and locking their hair, and then coming over to Jamaica and winning dance hall competitions, right? Right. So CGI is not doing anything that wasn't already done there, but the problem is it increases the capacity for people who were not sophisticated or obsessive about blackness to then perform aspects of blackness in a way that can be harmful to the community, right?
Hmm.
Uh,
Hmm.
and so, and it's creeping in really weird ways, but it's also part of our current media moment where we don't trust, right? Trust is certainly trust and grace are capacities that we seem to have lost. And I tie that directly to the pandemic, but we could also talk about the presidency before the pandemic. We could talk about the way that the country destabilized when we elected a black president. We could talk about the Great Recession. We could talk about 9/11 and the 20-year Afghanistan war. All of those things contributed to the incivility and things online. But in particular, there's been a large upswelling of distrust in authorities, in fact, and a certain type of facts, a sort of liberal approach to reality, right? And expertise. But before we were talking CGI, we used to talk Photoshop. Nobody even says Photoshop anymore,
Not at all.
right? Megan Thee Stallion drops a bar where my ass is real, ain't no curves on the wall,
Oh
right?
yeah.
The manipulation of images has a longer history than social media. It's just that, again, social media allows it to spread much further than it would have, right? And that's something that we need to address. But also, I'm really curious, is there a way that we can rebuild trust, not necessarily in government, because government ain't here for us and your job won't love you, right? But in each other. Right. And so I think you're right. In many ways, I'm seeing an upswell of nastiness and vitriol online.
Hmm.
But I'm also aware as a researcher that the algorithm is tuned to bring you that type of stuff because it knows you will react to it. And so there's a reason why I focus on Black Joy on my account. I'm always posting babies and beautiful Black people, right?
Yes.
Because we'll see enough vitriol if you let it happen. But if you curate your garden, if you pull the weeds, right, you can build a social media space that does not focus on that particular stuff. And it's hard to convince people to do that because, like, I was just talking to a class earlier today, and I asked them, how many of y'all pay for Twitter? Nobody does. It's $8 a month. I'm not paying for that experience. However, if you don't pay for it, you get more ads,
Hmm.
right? You get less content moderation. And I would argue you probably get less response from the content moderation team, right? So you're getting a degraded experience, much like what you would get with Google, right?
Wow.
If you don't know how to put an ad block and certain types of safe search extensions on your Chrome browser or whatever browser you use, your Google experience is trash. There's SEO, there's consumer ads, there's misinformation that Google itself is promoting to you, and then you might get your result by page 2, page 3, if you get it at all, right? And so in addition to, the ways that people are reacting, they're reacting to things that are infrastructural. They can feel them, they can experience them, but they don't necessarily interact with them in the same way. And final piece on this, there was just a study just released, and this is one of the benefits of having written about this for close to 20 years, right? And it turns out that in terms of trolling and harassment and victim chasing and doxing, the internet is actually not much different than it always has been. Right. Again, we've given people with less technical skills the capacity to reach more people. Right. There are people who don't know how to program who can now deploy phishing algorithmic software to steal money from people. Right. But there have always been nasty people in the world. Right. This is my thing with decoloniality. You get rid of the racists, you still got assholes. You still have pedophiles. You still have all these other people. How are you going to deal with that? Right. And so, yeah, the internet is not necessarily worse than it has been, but we are now sensitized to it in a way. Will Smith said this really well. It's not that police are killing more Black people. It's now that we have video of it. Now that we have this experience with everyday doom scrolling where the engagement algorithm serves us this crap every day. Google serves us crap every day. Instagram tries to sell us stuff. TikTok is now trying to sell us stuff. You're going to see a world that is not necessarily reflective of the world you want to be in or the world you actually exist in. It's tailored to extract from you so that they can make money.
You know, I want to present a counterpoint here,
Go for
specifically centering on just certain progressive movements that have bubbled up in this space.
Yep.
Because I don't want to lose sight of just, again, the social, cultural, and political power of Black communication as it operates in digital space today. And with that said, I'm curious, can you share any moments from your research or in your own experience in Black cybercultures that really illustrate the power of networked Black communication? Or more specifically, how's our expression or language on social media platforms cause shifts just across our social or political landscape? I'm thinking about Black Girl Magic, Me Too.
Yep.
You mentioned police violence. So, yeah.
Yep. I mean, the canonical examples are Ferguson, right? But even before Ferguson, before we had the social media, the social network environment we had today, we had Trayvon.
Yeah.
And although Twitter and Instagram were much more mature by the time the trial happened, before that, Instagram and our websites and our places like Black Planet and blogs were putting up conversations where Black people were like, this was wrong. This was terrible. Somebody needs to talk about it. So I talk about something that people have completely forgotten. In 2000, I think it was 6 or 7, might have been 8. 6 boys were actually convicted of lynching in a small town called Gina, Louisiana. Regina 6. And it almost died. Like they was about to be Louisiana's already terrible, but they were about to be railroaded into prison systems, life completely ruined. But a journalist in Chicago picked up the story and fed it to the blogs. So not only the newspapers doing it, but this growing Black blog sphere, right? Not just the blogs of the time, so Young Black and Fabulous YBF, Nicole Bitchie, Concrete Loop, right? But also smaller political Black blogs, which there were huge numbers of them, Jack and Jill Politics, and so many others, right? Pick this up. And before we had social networks, we had these spaces, these much smaller, less interactive spaces, but picked up and talked to both the people on the ground in Gina, had interviews with them, but also long form essays and articles talking about what it meant to be Black in the South, in the US, to deal with this prison system. And so that's always been a space. My argument for the internet is it's both a poison and a cure. But the cure is for Black folk is that it makes us aware that we are all in the same struggle. So Cincinnati has tons of police killings that you would never know about unless you was from Cincinnati until the internet. Tamir Rice would have just been a minor story, right, if they hadn't picked it up on social media and spoken about it, right? But my thing is that while catharsis and pain and trauma does some work to bring us together, you won't stay together unless you learn to love and care for the people you're in the struggle with. And Black Twitter, for me in particular, but social media in general and the internet has brought Black people together. And this is why I call my book Distributed Blackness. Even though we're distributed in points across the country, we have some chocolate cities, we have much less of us out west, some of us up north, but it makes us a collective, right? In a way that might not necessarily end up at the voting booth, but will be loud enough for the people who are the decision influencers, the makers, the movers, and the shakers to come online and at least hear us or at least see us, right, in a way that letters to your congressman never would have. And so I try to talk about both, right? I try to talk about how we build these capacities for love and care, because Sean Thompson's Black Girl Magic is fantastic. right? You want to talk about gatekeeping? Let's talk about how Black Girl Magic, as Miss Kashan talked about it, is poor Black girls in the hood. Black girls in front of the stove doing their baby's hair with a hot comb, right? Trans girls, girls with wigs and weaves. Like, she talked about everyday Black life, but Beverly Bond wanted to buy it for this thing where she celebrated Black excellence. Black excellence is magical, but you know it's even more magical? People making a way out of no way. That's magic, right? So I love the internet in part because it has this ratchetry on it,
Yes.
right? You can't stop the ratchetry from happening because now everybody has a smartphone with an internet connected camera locked to it. And if they want to act out, they can take a picture of them act out. Sometimes we get videos of people twerking at brunch. I don't want that. I'm not here for that. But I appreciate that people are so enthused about pancakes and salt shakers that look like Hennessy bottles that they get up and start dancing on the table when the DJ plays the music too loud. Because that's what we do. We enjoy. We don't just sit there and be like, oh, perfect. This is great. This ain't Love Jones no more, right? We express ourselves. And so some of it would say, oh, well, it's the fault of the cameras. People just want to act out. And my grandmother used to call it floor show, right? But that's also a piece of wanting people to be quiet and modern and civil so white folk will respect us. And like my people on Twitter have said, Martin Luther King got shot in a 3-piece suit. What you gonna do? Your respectability will not save you. A suit is not armor, right? It's simply an expression of a particular aesthetic that's linked to a particular group of people for their profit. And a Black person wearing a suit does not get you any more respect in the eyes of certainly the police.
Absolutely.
Right? Or a uniform. You remember the young man, the young lieutenant, army lieutenant in Virginia who got maced in his own car at a gas station by the police.
Yeah.
Right. So the pretense that there's certain aesthetics will protect us, the internet has done a lot to debunk that.
Absolutely.
Right. And I will always appreciate it for that.
I'm just thinking about just our whole analysis around respectability politics. It's a bit of a speculative question, but I'm not sure if we would have had that conversation. We couldn't have had that conversation en masse without these communicative platforms, this distributed Blackness, network communication. So folks can speak back to power, because so often the legacy media institutions will model a respectable performance of Blackness. And this was one of the few times where we could finally see ourselves. It's like, wait a minute, we don't have to be ashamed of how we adorn ourselves and how we exist in our bodies on a day-to-day level. So, to round it out, though, I want to look ahead to the future. And you've written about other Black platforms, such as Black Planet and this wasn't explicitly Black, but the previous version of Twitter, was it Blackbird?
It was a web browser, actually. Some Black developers came together, formed a company, and modified a browser so that it would have features that they felt would be attractive to Black people. So instead of just Facebook and MySpace, they also had Black Planet as one of the things you could log into in the browser without having to leave. Like, it was on a sidebar, basically, like a lot of browsers do today, right? And so, a future, right? So we have a couple of Black futures that are going on right now with the digital diaspora that's happening from Twitter. There's Spill, which is run by Black folk. There's Spoutable, which is run by Christopher Boozy, who came to fame as a election strategist during the thing, and then he decided to build a social network, right? So here's the thing. How many Black soul food restaurants do you have in your neighborhood? 3, 4, if you're lucky, or 1 or 2 in the city, right?
Yeah.
Is every one of them as good as the other?
No, not at all.
Black folk will go to the one that they like. So just because something is Black owned doesn't necessarily mean it will be the thing that Black people are drawn to, right? And so there's more to a Black social media experience than Black ownership. There's content moderation. There's the ethos of the community. Like, we could talk about OK Player, which was owned by Black folk, right? But they also built this musically inclined, music nerd damn near, but social and cultural community based on a certain group of musicians out of the Philadelphia, Virginia, New York axis, right? And so there's capacity for Black communities to build. They largely need spaces to where they can be unbothered, the hair salon, the beauty salon, right? And spaces which afford a relative flat hierarchy. Twitter's been really good for that, right? So when Twitter first started, Rihanna had an account that was at Rihanna, but she didn't have a social media manager. That was Rihanna,
Yeah.
right? And so you had a chance on Twitter to talk to celebrities, and they would talk back to you. Right, not like the podcast we have today, where it's six guys in a room sitting on a couch, and they just talk for 2 hours, and you're supposed to listen to them. It was actual interaction on them, right?
Mhm.
And so, what I'm really describing is this concept called a third place, which we've been lamenting a lot recently on a number of media, because our physical third places have been really destroyed, right? Community centers don't really exist or are underfunded. They don't want kids in the malls. We used to congregate in the malls and just sit in the food court and talk all day. They don't want kids at the movie theaters. They don't want kids at the parks, right? They don't want Black people at the clubs. And I can kind of understand having, had to duck bullets every once in a while, or violence at a particular club. But some of that pressure that happens at the club is because there's nowhere else for people to go, right? And so if you had a place to go that wasn't work, that wasn't home, and real talk, wasn't the church, where you could be yourself with people who weren't trying to lord it over you because they have a better job or something. Y'all were all there basically kicking and talking, like a barbershop,
Yes.
right? Where y'all share knowledge, y'all share information, y'all talk about the events of the day and things you worry and fear, things all kinds of deep topics come up in these spaces, right? Those are the spaces that are going to succeed. So none of the spaces that are out right now, and I'm including Threads and Mastodon and Blue Sky in this, none of them have reached a critical mass of Blackness where I argue that we're going to see the same type of activity that we've seen on Twitter for the last decade.
I'm just concerned that it may fall apart. So many of the things that I loved about Twitter, as since Elon has taken over, it's the landscape has just shifted so much. And one thing I really want to hold on to that still operates on Twitter, but it's been somewhat delegitimized, is our ability to speak back to power in mass. Like when I saw Black folks tweeting at Target, like during a riot, telling them what they're going to do, or talking back to celebrities, politicians in a way that, we just never experienced before. It's like the way that we would talk about like things in our living rooms on a porch, but now it's like, oh, we're all together. I guess I bring that up to ask, do you have any fears, just thinking about the future of not only this Black Twitter, but also these communicative platforms? You spoke about algorithms and how extractive they can be. Any fears exist there whatsoever around just the future of Black communication in digital spaces?
So two. The first one is the Black technical object. I'm gonna come back to that, but I'm bookmarking it, right? The thing that's really worrying about the current social media environment and economy is that they have focused on gathering all this data that we generate. And I prefer to talk about information rather than data. Data is a record of what I have done, but the person I am is what I am after that. So when you have a system that's built on collecting what I have done, you get predictive systems like Compass or social work algorithms that say, oh, well, you did this back then, so you don't necessarily deserve anything now. And in effect, a large amount of AI right now is surveillance, right? With a fancy title. So there was an article a few months ago, where Taco Bell and a couple other places were thinking about putting AI run cameras at the register so that they could make sure that the employees were doing upselling. Like, fam, you brought me here to sell fries, right? Like, but now you want to surveil me. And that it has precedent. Amazon warehouses have long relied on an algorithm to track the activity of the workers, in part because they're supposed to be hyper efficient, right? You're supposed to be able to get a certain number of items at a certain amount of time so that this order can go out and fulfill their 2-day thing. In many ways, Amazon's warehouses resemble a plantation. So are their driver systems, right? They're asking people to work long hours under the surveillance of an algorithm to meet a pick rate. And if that sounds like a plantation, it's intentional. I think it's intentional, right? They have to meet a pick rate. And if they don't meet a pick rate, the algorithm, which we weren't calling AI back then, but it absolutely is AI, can fire them. That's the future that they want. And they're building that future largely off social media data, but also an ethos of anti-Blackness tied to a collection of data about how we move through the world. And there are efforts to do ethical AI, right? There are also some people who are building training data for the large language models like ChatGPT that focus on Black culture, right? So Black books, Black speeches, Black tweets, Black Black music, right? But my guy Ramon Amaro, who's over in the UK, came up with this concept that I love called the Black technical object. And he
Okay.
was referring with this concept to Joy Buolamwini's project, admirable project, where she was wondering why her Black face was not visible to cameras. And so
Mhm.
she wanted to build a model / algorithm so that Black faces could be detected. And Amaro was like, what you doing?
Yeah.
Why are you making us more visible to a system which is built to surveil us and put us in a trick bag? Every week I see something new where somebody was completely misidentified by AI because AI has terrible recognition rates for brown faces.
Hmm.
Even though they have an abundance of data about brown faces, the camera is not tuned, the algorithm is not tuned, and the anti-blackness gets in the way. So they misidentify people, but they will put people in jail based on that AI thing, even if you can prove with your cell phone data that you were miles away doing something else. They prefer to believe the AI than they do your own data. Right. And so that idea of the Black techno object, particularly with respect to AI, bothers me because making Blackness more visible only exposes us to more. Here I am gatekeeping, right? Exposes us in many ways to more exploitation and extraction, but
Yeah.
it's kind of unavoidable at this point. Right. That ship has largely sailed. I was talking with some students today, like these college age kids, right? They had to deal with beginning at the start of the pandemic with these companies that put in proctoring software, right? So
Mhm.
they're at their laptop taking tests, and the software would say, "Oh, you move too far from the screen. You're trying to cheat. You fail." Or there's too much noise in the background. You must be listening to another lesson. You fail. Or you're surfing another website. You must be trying to cheat on this actual test. So you fail. Right. And so these things have already made its way into our mundane lives. And that's only going to get worse from here on out. One
Right.
way to combat this is to do the type of everyday resistance that Black folk are good at. Right,
Mhm.
whether
Mhm.
it's slowdowns on the factory line, or there's so many other things which are slightly not unethical, if not illegal. We find ways to work around the things, right? That's one way to do it. Legislation is not going to fix it,
Mhm.
right? And so it's like, how do we come up with ways to defeat how we're being hailed, how we're being apprehended by these technologies? That's what keeps me up at night. So when
Absolutely.
I'm asked to write about AI, and I get asked on a fairly regular basis, I don't know what to say because I don't have anything good to say about
Fam, this is giving me
it.
so
that's
much.
that's a
Oh,
future, right?
look. Yes.
That's a future, right?
Yes.
Uh, there are possibilities because people are much more aware now of fantastic scholars that are doing decolonial work and abolition work. There are folk like Timnit Gebru, Alex Hanna, Abiba Birhane, Deb Raji, all these fantastic women and queer scientists who are poking holes in this myth that AI is somehow the best way to think and move around the world, right? But it's little stuff. We have to keep promoting that type of thing. But we also have to get people to be more skeptical about
Mhm.
the type of technology. So my colleague down here at University of Florida, Kevin Winstead, is coming out with this fantastic book talking about Afro skepticism, right?
Ah.
Where we know that there are things we can participate in, but we hesitate. Sometimes we even outright refuse because we know it's not good for us. Right. And so it's different from saying, oh, I just love all technology or I just hate all technology. It's more of a measured response to the fuckery that might be about to encounter you that you know you can't avoid, but you're going to figure out ways to work around it. Right. And I
Listen,
think it's a fantastic concept.
Andre, you giving us Black History Year After Dark. This is so much, so rich. For folks who want to
Thank
follow
you.
up on that thread around AI surveillance and whatnot, please follow up on the many names that Andre just dropped. I'm also thinking about Ruha Benjamin, Race After Technology,
Absolutely.
Catherine
Hmm.
McKittrick, a lot of
Yeah.
folks concerned with these questions.
Sophia Noble. Please get Sophia if you can. Sophia is a fantastic interview.
Oh,
But yeah.
write that down, producers. Okay, I just got really one question left because so much of our conversation is centered around Afro optimism and joy. I want to leave on that note as well. I'm curious, Andre, if you had to create a modern day green book, what would that include? What would it be about? How would it help folks?
Uh, So I argue for the Green Book as one of the first network browsers, right? It wasn't exactly a map because a map is a fiction. It's a narrative laid over a landscape, right? Of places, of routes that we want to take, how to get where we go. And the Green Book was more than that. The Green Book showed nodes of Black life and leisure. So if you were a traveler, with a car, a fancy car, because you make a little money because you work on the line in Detroit and you want to drive down south to see your people, it would really help for you to know what gas stations you can get gas from, or what gas station have the good food that you can get food from at the same time, because that's something Black people invented, right? Or what beaches you can go to where white folk won't bother you. So Manhattan Beach out in California, or Myrtle Beach down south, or the Upper Peninsula for Black folk in Michigan, right? And so, do you ever notice how bad restaurant websites are?
Y'all, oh my gosh. Yes. Yeah.
And Yelp is not helpful. Foursquare is no longer helpful, right? The various food delivery things aren't helpful. So just on the base quality of Black life, I would love something that featured more information gathering on what Black places are good to go, what white places are safe to go, right? Just on a restaurant basis. For people who are parents, something that does a better job of mapping out daycares,
Ooh.
right? For people who are transplants to new cities, where's the barber shops and not the Instagram salons? Right? The places, the barber and beauty shops that provide full service. Because Instagram, I think, has done more to destroy the hair care industry than it has to help. So things that are centered around Black life, the resource you need to eat, the places you want to go for safety, the places you want to go to feel better about yourself, right? So this is Black aesthetics, right? The capacity to live a better life. That would be the start of a green book for me, right? Not necessarily, places to, like, there have been some fantastic apps like recording interactions with the police in case you get stopped. By the time you record, you're already in trouble, right? And those things are necessary, but I would rather focus more so on building resources for a better life than saying that our future is only to be watchful and wary and afraid of the things that we have to encounter every day, right? Because you're still going to do that. But if you also know there's a place at the end of the road where you can relax, that's as important, if not more so.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much for that rich
That's a
response.
great question. Send me this recording so I can make that a book.
I got you. That was Andre Brock, y'all, author of Distributed Blackness, African American Cybercultures. It's open source, so you can actually find it free wherever you get your ebooks. But remember, our communication holds immense power. It's helped us survive, mobilize, and be in community with each other against oppressive odds. So, whether online or in real life, how do you plan to use Black communicative practices to connect and express yourself? Until next week, y'all, be free. You're living in history. At PushBlack, we agree with Marcus Garvey when he said, a people without knowledge of their past history, origin, and culture is like a tree without roots. We believe telling empowering stories on Black life and history can build a more liberated Black future. Being here with us lets us know you probably feel like that's important too. You matter. Your choice to be here matters. It lets us know that you value this work, and you make PushBlack happen with your contributions at blackhistoryyear.com. Most people do $5 or $10 a month, but everything makes a difference. Thank you for supporting the work.